The Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES, recently published 4 landmark regional assessment reports, one each for the Americas, Africa, Europe and Central Asia, and Asia and the Pacific. The result of 3 years of work by more than 550 leading experts from over 100 countries, the 4 IPBES reports are the most important expert contribution of the past decade to the state of knowledge about biodiversity and nature's contributions to people. The reports focus on answers to key questions about the importance of biodiversity, progress being made to conserve it, and the threats and opportunities for a sustainable future. With the best available information communicated effectively, people all over the world can make better decisions and take more effective action to meet global commitments such as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the Aichi Biodiversity Targets, and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. The Americas are biologically and culturally diverse, with extensive wilderness areas and 7 out of the 17 most biodiverse countries in the world. The region accounts for 40% of nature's capacity to contribute to people's demands. Yet 65% of these contributions are now in decline, with 21% declining strongly. The IPBES report shows that despite being home to just 13% of the global population, the Americas are responsible for almost 23% of the world's ecological footprint. Over the next 30 years, the region's population is projected to increase by 20% and gross domestic product to nearly double, resulting in further increases in consumption. By 2050, human-induced climate change will be the fastest growing driver negatively impacting biodiversity in the Americas. Combined with unsustainable agricultural practices, this is projected to further degrade most land-based, freshwater, and coastal ecosystems. Although the protection of key biodiversity areas has increased, fewer than 20% are currently protected. The report emphasizes the need to better utilize indigenous and local knowledge, implement effective conservation policies, and make human-dominated landscapes more supportive of biodiversity and nature's contributions to people. Some countries in the Americas may achieve aspects of the Aichi biodiversity targets, the Sustainable Development Goals and their climate commitments, but continued biodiversity loss could significantly undermine these efforts. The message from all 4 IPBES regional assessment reports is that, with the exception of some positive examples, biodiversity and nature's capacity to contribute to people are being degraded, reduced, and lost due to a number of common pressures, including habitat stress, the overexploitation and unsustainable use of natural resources, air, land, and water pollution, increasing numbers and impacts of invasive alien species, as well as climate change, among others.
The best available evidence, gathered by the world's leading experts, points us now to a single conclusion. We must act to halt and reverse the unsustainable use of nature, or risk not only the future we want, but even the lives we currently lead. Fortunately, the evidence also shows that we know how to protect and partially restore our vital natural assets.
IPBES, Science and Policy for People and Nature.
Hi everyone, welcome to this session of the IPBES webinar series. It's great to have you with us. I hope you enjoyed the short video teasing the findings of the Americas assessment, and that you're looking forward to going more in depth into the assessment findings with Jake Rice, who is one of the 3 assessment co-chairs and who's here with us today. In addition to this webinar, which will be held in English, Jake's 2 co-chairs, Cristiana Simão Seixas and Maria Elena Saccagnini, will join us in subsequent webinars to present the assessment findings in Portuguese and Spanish respectively. Before giving the floor to Jake, I'd like to remind you that the recording of this webinar as well as a copy of this PowerPoint presentation, will be made available on the IPBES website. On the IPBES website, you can also access a range of other resources, including recordings of all previous webinars, the full report and summary for policymakers of the Americas assessment, as well as any other completed assessment, and e-learning tools. If you have any questions about the webinar series or any other aspects of IPBES work on capacity building, please don't hesitate to contact us on email tsu.capacitybuilding@ipbes.net. Now, without further ado, let me hand over to our presenter for the day. Thank you for taking the time to join us, Jake. We look forward to hearing your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Håkan, and I'm delighted to be here. I hope I make the next half hour to 45 minutes interesting for you. Through this time, we're going to cover a number of things that you can find in the larger assessment and its summary for policymakers. We'll explain first the process that produced the assessment, and then go through what it says about the current status of biodiversity and its contributions to people. Focus a little bit on what those contributions of nature to people are, what the drivers, what the causes of change in those contributions and in biodiversity is. Look in some depth at the trends that we're seeing, both in biodiversity and the ways it contributes to all of our well-being, and what's projected into the future under different scenarios of choices that we make as societies and governments of what path we want to be on in the future. From that information, we can look at what the policy instruments we have available to us are and what the options we have for using them in combination to choose what pathways forward we would like to take. And of course, we'll end with a few of the places where our knowledge is incomplete and where more work will help us make better choices for the future. First of all, let's consider the background to the report. We can look at the timetable, the steps forward, and what the process was that produced it, and how we went about ensuring that it would provide the best information possible for the tasks we were given. Now, the timetable covered a full 3 years, not even including setting back in the summer of 2014, laying out the scope for the assessment and the process that would follow. The period after we had a good scoping document ready to ask parties and groups of experts, intergovernmental agencies, conservation groups for nominations of experts and putting the teams together. Then there were 3 drafts prepared. A first draft that took from June, nearly a year, from June of 2015 to April of 16. And that draft was reviewed by experts who had no role in producing it. It was revised based on that very broad expert input and sent again to, in its second round, more experts, some of the same ones, and every party, every country in the Americas to take comments. Those comments were incorporated into a final draft and the summary for policymakers that summarizes the policy relevant messages in the full assessment. And that was taken finally in March of 2018 to a plenary where the parties in the room negotiated, discussed sentence by sentence through the whole summary for policymakers and accepted this. Now, the team that put it together was large. There were the three co-chairs that Hakan mentioned, myself, Christiana Siasos, Maria Elena Zaccagnini. Working with us for the 6 chapters were 2 or 3 coordinating lead authors for each chapter. They in turn had teams of from a dozen to 20 additional experts working on each chapter. Every chapter had a fellow, which was an early career scientist assigned to work in support to the chapter leads and do a lot of the supporting necessary work to get the job done. And then 200 or 300 what we call contributing authors, individuals that are experts in a narrow, well, sometimes a broad field, but experts in a field where we need a specific piece of information, sometimes a couple paragraphs drafted, and we reached out to. So this whole pyramid fed into the product you're going to see. We had guidance throughout it from the IPBES Bureau and Multidisciplinary Expert Panel, which are the global leadership for IPBES. And at each stage, we had external review editors make sure that our responses to any of the comments we received on the first order draft and the second order draft and the third order draft before it went to parties were very responsibly and thoroughly done. Now, this review process was important. As I've said earlier, there was one just by experts on the first order draft and then one by experts and parties on the second order draft. We had more than 5,600 comments in total, about 2/3 of them from experts in relative disciplines, 1/3 directly from governments, and very often I can say from my own experience, the governments had experts within government. These are not all just policy hacks commenting from a policy perspective, but the comments from governments are every bit as expert-based as the comments from the external experts. We had 247 external reviewers that we recruited to comment on the report and its quality, and 12 governments from all the Americas participated fully in the review process. Now, the whole assessment is structured regionally, and many of the figures you're going to see as we go through this are broken out by regions. There's what's called North America, which is the US, Canada, and Greenland. Mesoamerica, which is all the countries of Central America. South America, of course, shown in green on this figure. And then the Caribbean. The purple doesn't show up well in the figure because the individual island countries are so small, but they certainly receive substantial attention in the assessment. Now, in terms of the current status in the Americas, you'll find in the early part of the summary for policymakers, comparing the Americas to the globe as a whole. We've got 55 of the nearly 200 terrestrial and freshwater ecoregions of the world in the Americas to address, an important share. 20% of all the areas globally that are flagged as key biodiversity areas, 26% of the terrestrial hotspots, slightly less of the aquatic. We've got nearly a quarter of the 14,000 species that have been identified by the International Union for Conservation of Nature as at some high risk of extinction, threatened, seriously threatened or endangered. And the Americas have been a center of origin and a center of domestication for many crops important to human well-being: potato, corn, beans, and many others. So globally, we're important. When I said you'll see many things in this webinar and the assessment as a whole broken out by region, you'll also see them broken out by what we call units of analysis. For those of you with ecology backgrounds, you're familiar with the concept of biomes. And these are similar to that concept. But because we include in our units of analysis urbanized areas, intense agriculture areas, which are not usually considered natural biomes, we simply use the term units of analysis. And you can see some of them are widespread, like the temperate and boreal forests in North America, the very light lime green, the orange patch of grassland, the tropical forests in South America. But many of these units analysis are very limited habitats, like the small amount of dark purple, which represents what are called Mediterranean habitats, because they are so similar to the forested areas on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, which is where they got their name. You'll also see many things broken out by these units of analysis because of their importance to the biodiversity and the ways that people live within them. They're also a good benchmark of how well we're protecting, conserving these units of analysis and what's already been lost. 95% of all the tall grass prairie in North America has already been converted from its natural state to usually some kind of intensive agriculture. Nearly 3/4 of the tropical dry forest in Mesoamerica, 2/3 in the Caribbean, has already been lost. 88% of the Atlantic tropical forests of South America. And we can go down this list. I don't have to read them all, but they show how much of the major biomes in the Americas has already been transformed into what we call human-dominated landscapes. Urban areas, infrastructure bands like highways, railroads, and farm or managed forest land. Now, going just from the state of nature to man and nature together, in the Americas, we've got 13% of the world's population. But that 13% is accounting for 34% of the global gross domestic product. So it's an economic engine for the globe. We've got 2 of the 10 largest Human Development Index countries globally, but also one of the poorest. And this diversity of humanity as well as nature within the Americas is an important part of the assessment. The 13% of the global population doesn't just produce over 1/3 of the global GDP, it produces nearly 1/4 of the total global human ecological footprint. So not only are we producing a lot of wealth, we're costing the planet a great deal to produce it. The majority of countries in the Americas are using nature more intensively than the global average, and more intensively than nature can renew its contributions it makes to our quality of life. And this is a really important message from the assessment. Now, this population of the Americas is diverse just as its habitats and species are. Unique compared to the other 3 regional assessments. A very large proportion of the human population in the Americas are descendants of immigrants from Europe, Asia, and Africa. And we often think of the cultures as being based on the old world. But we need to keep in sight And the assessment gives a lot of attention to the fact that there are still 66 million indigenous peoples, and they have a huge cultural diversity from which we'll see through the assessment is crucial to understanding man's relationship with nature. The Amazon alone has over 400 identified indigenous tribes and groups of peoples. We've got 15% of the world's living languages, even though the vast majority of humans in the Americas speak Spanish, English, Portuguese, or French. Now, if we turn to how those people really relate to nature, within the IPBES process, this is called Nature's Contributions to People. In the Americas, we are fortunate to have 40% of the world's ecosystem capacity to produce nature-based materials that we can eat, use for energy, fresh water, other benefits we'll see later, and to assimilate the byproducts from our uses of nature. 40% of the world's capacity. And this contributes in really important ways to, on a global standard, a high level of food security, a high level of water security, energy security, provision of livelihoods for peoples, their health, physical and mental, as well as a number of non-material contributions to our well-being we'll see in just a minute. And these economic values, when you try to measure them, are the equivalent of an annual gross domestic product of all the Americas. More than $24 trillion just from the land-based nature's contributions from people each year is the value we're taking from nature. And this shows up in this figure. The purple circles represent the economic value we take per capita for each of the four regions. The Americas, North America, and South America are the two really big purple circles. That's where humanity takes the most per capita. The Mesoamerica and Caribbean, far less per capita, and the smaller blue circles are per hectare. And we can see that per hectare, we're much more equivalent between the four subregions of the Americas. It's per capita where the well-being is really dominated by North America and South America. The assessment, although we'll see some concerning trends in a few minutes, has a lot of encouraging messages as well. We've got 3 times more resources to work with per capita than the global average. Food production is high in the Americas already and is increasing. And it's a major contributor to food security everywhere from local communities to the global efforts to deal with hunger and malnutrition. 90% of the population in the Americas has access to improved and usually reliable and clean water sources. In a third of the countries in the Americas, all the people have access to electrical power, and in all but one of the countries in the other 2/3, at least 80% of the population have access to electrical power on a reliable basis. Biodiversity supports a lot of contributions essential to our health, to our quality of life. Medicinal organisms, plants, things derived from medicinal plants, and the physical and the psychological benefits from experiencing nature. Those are developed in some detail in the assessment if you're interested in all those contributions. And then there's the regulatory functions that are beginning to take a higher and higher prominence in discussions of man's relationship to nature, including maintaining high clean water, regulating natural hazards such as landslides, floods, extreme events, and regulation of organisms that are detrimental to our well-being, disease transporting animals, etc. Now, the fact that we depend on so many things from nature means a lot of things we do are changing nature. And these are what we call drivers that change nature and its ability to contribute to people. Indirect drivers are the basic ways that human society and populations are structured that are the ultimate causes of these changes. There's the human population itself and the fact that it's continuing to grow at a faster rate in Latin America and the Caribbean than in North America, but it's growing in all the regions. There's just more people whose needs have to be satisfied. We have governance systems that have weaknesses. There are centralized modes of governments in almost every country in the Americas, with the degree in which power is centralized quite variable. But the more power is decentralized down to local communities to make their own choices. There have been many social and environmental conflicts that arise from these tensions. And the assessment, without saying we have solutions to this, really provides information to help understand how the nature of governance is tied to the trends in nature's ability to support humanity. Likewise with inequality. Social inequality, economic inequality is still a concern in all the subregions of the Americas. Data on how extreme it is in some places you can find in the assessment. But what we really focus on is how the inequity, not just the average well-being, but the difference among peoples in the same area, is a real ultimate driver of pressure on nature for all kinds of reasons that you can find in the assessment. From people in such poverty that they cannot make sustainable choices, to power so centralized that there's no constraints on how it uses the environment. Now, there's a lot of discussion about what economic growth does for nature. Is it sustainable? And you'll find it clearly explained in the assessment how economic growth and global trade, it can be positive or it can be negative. It's not categorically bad or good for biodiversity and nature's contributions to people. But on balance, over the recent decades, the adverse impacts have been dominating in nature compared to the benefits you can take from it. And this is one of the places where the regional differences are particularly large. North America produces nearly a quarter of the global GDP, with only 5%, less than 5% of the global population. So tremendously productive, but it also produces 1/6 of the global greenhouse gases, which contribute to climate change, from that same less than 5% of the population. So per capita, North Americans are producing 3 times more greenhouse gases than the global average. The Americas as a whole generates nearly 20%, nearly 1/5 of all the world's exports. And of that, 70% come from North America. Latin America has substantially less global trade, but it is much more dependent on immediate nature-based commodities, food, timber, things taken directly from nature without value-added manufacturing involved. And this pattern really strongly influences both the impacts of the different cultures on nature and how man's relationship to nature is governed. There's been a six-fold increase in the gross domestic product in the Americas since 1960. And there's been great improvements in quality of life for very large numbers of people. They've had better food, better water supply, better access to energy. But it's also through this increase in GDP and the globalization of trade, which has produced the wealth, it's disconnected the lives of the people doing the consumption from nature's production of what is being consumed. And this is an important thing also developed in the assessment, that people's understanding of their relationship to nature is decreasing with every generation. Now, when we go from the indirect drivers to the very direct things, there are three major ways that nature is being changed by the consequences of these indirect things about humanity: people, trade, economic development. One of them is the amount of habitat that's being converted from natural states to human-dominated states, or fragmented, so the natural blocks of the unchanged blocks of nature are smaller and smaller and more isolated from each other. There's the overexploitation and overharvesting, directly using nature more intensively. Fisheries, this had been a huge problem. There has been some improvement in the last 2 decades, but there's still a long way to go for many overexploited resources to recover. Lumber, we'll see in a few minutes, has gone from some pressure to less pressure to, in recent years, in some regions, much more pressure as much as ever. And then there's climate change and the direct impacts of both local weather in the short term and the overall average changes in climate are a new pressure on nature that we are only beginning to understand its magnitude, the pathways by which it occurs, and the many ways it's affecting humanity's ability to deal with and benefit from nature. And these drivers are what causes the trends that we're seeing in both nature itself and the contributions it makes to human well-being. Some of the trends highlighted in the assessment: coral reefs are a very special, high-quality habitat in coastal areas. Already by the 1970s, coral reef quality, as measured by experts, declined by more than 50% in the Americas, and it reached 90% by the early 2000s. Now, one of the new pressures on coral reefs are what they call coral bleaching, from periods of really anomalously hot waters. And a major event in 2005 reduced that 10% that was left by substantial amounts, but variable amounts around the region. But coral reefs are one of the most pressured types of biomes in the Americas. But marine biodiversity overall particularly in coastal areas like coral reefs and mangroves, have shown major losses, and we show how these vary regionally in the assessment. The dryland habitats in North America have undergone further loss in the last last 2 decades, partly due to further conversion to human-dominated systems and partly due to increasingly hot and dry summers, causing the biodiversity in arid lands to be under even greater pressure. One of the measures that people who are experts in biodiversity use is an abstract metric called mean species abundance. And I have to explain this. The easiest way to conceive of it is if you took a walk through the countryside and simply recorded an impression of how many different kinds of birds and how many birds you saw, what the vegetation was like, how many animals you saw, that it's a way to measure that mean abundance of nature. And if we start with a benchmark of 1500, when the European colonization of the Americas started in a serious way, between 1500 and 2010, 30% of the biodiversity in the entire Americas has just been reduced. Doesn't mean 30% of the species went extinct, but that impression you get of how much nature you're experiencing has been reduced by 30%. And we can see how this has been distributed in particular kinds of forests and particular kinds of habitats through all the regions. And how big the regional diversity is. We can see between the 4 subregions in the Americas. In the Caribbean, the amount of forested area has actually gone up from 1980 to the present, as marginal agriculture lands are being more and more abandoned and allowed to return to nature. On the other hand, in Mesoamerica and in South America, the 2 areas that started off richest in forest cover, the trends are markedly downward and continuing. So these regional differences are an important part of the message in the assessment and a good incentive to check parts of the assessment you care about. We tried to put a huge amount of that information together in this table that initially may look very complex and confusing. But the messages that come across in it are really quite simple. Across the top, the columns of the table represent the major contributions that our assessment looked at, contributions nature makes to people, whether it's food supply, medicinal plants, all those different regulating services. And down in the rows are all the different units of analysis. The colors in the boxes where these intersect are simply how important that particular unit of analysis is to producing that particular benefit. Because of course, not all of nature contributes equally to food supply, to regulating extreme events in the weather and things like that. But this lays out through the colors of the figures from dark green being really important to the dark red being of low importance, the relative contribution of each unit of analysis to each benefit. And then the arrows within them are how is that particular combination of the contribution of that unit of analysis to that benefit trending at present. And the message in here is that 2/3, 65% of nature's contributions to people are declining right now, and 1/5 of them are declining very strongly. Strongly enough that rapid policy interventions that are effective will be necessary to maintain the ability to take that benefit from nature. Now, what are some of the concerns that you can pull out of a figure like that? Per capita water supply is declining. There is less water for each of us. And both groundwater and surface water are being used at unsustainable rates in many parts of the Americas. Biofuel and hydropower have increased in all subregions, but using nature plant materials for biofuels, converting natural water systems to hydroelectric power, both have big biodiversity costs to get this increase in energy. There's been a decline in foods per capita, livelihoods, ability to employ people in nature, and the cultural continuity of indigenous people in coastal areas. Everywhere that the coastal areas have experienced a loss of biodiversity, from coral bleaching, sedimentation or contamination of the waters and the outflow of a river. If you lose the biodiversity, the coastal communities suffer everywhere. And overall, the footprint of humanity ecologically has increased between 2-fold and 3-fold since the 1960s in every part of the Americas. It doesn't mean that we're already doomed. The fact that we had that 40% of global biocapacity and only 13% of the global human population means that we still have, as this figure shows, most areas with some what we call biocapacity, the capacity of nature to produce to support human well-being, contribute to it, is positive almost everywhere still. But the more we focus on economic development, the more we reduce the biocapacity per capita available to support us, as you can see from the way the figures in that upper graph converge toward the right-hand corner, and they get closer and closer to the neutral line. But things can be reversed. The lower figure there is a way to quantify the human footprint on nature. And we can see that even though North America has by far a higher per capita footprint than South America, Central America, or the Caribbean, it has been declining for most of the 2000s. We are finding ways to be more sustainable. How high that bar is compared to the others shows that we're a long way from being sustainable and equitable. But it also shows we can change the footprint that we're making on nature. And we do this by focusing back on the drivers, the things that cause those impacts. Right now, with the information we have available when we did the assessment, all the drivers in the trends in biodiversity and the trends in nature contribution to people are expected to intensify and expected to interact into the future. And with two-thirds of them going down, they're going to intensify the rate of decrease. This already means that very few of the what are called Aichi biodiversity targets adopted by the Convention on Biological Diversity to be met by 2020. Very few of them will be met anywhere in the Americas. And by 2050, with the population of the Americas increasing another 20% and the GDP increasing by nearly 100%, nearly doubling, those 20% of people will also have much more power to consume even more. So how we choose to consume is crucial to our future. And this means that despite the reductions that we've been able to document in the rate at which we're degrading some of our natural habitats, overall, we're still projected to lose nature right through until 2050. And this has some implications that need to be taken seriously. Even though we've reduced habitat in many areas, we've reduced habitat loss and the rate of conversion to intensive agriculture, forestry, or urban areas. That had been the most dominant driver prior to 1970, from the time of European colonization of the Americas right up till 1970. We're facing a new driver, climate change, and it is by far the fastest growing driver, and by 2050 it will be it's projected to be the single most dominant driver of change in biodiversity. So linking reactions to try to protect nature and the ways we depend on it has to be tightly linked to dealing with climate change. We have sustainable development goals that were adopted by the United Nations for global well-being. These trends will mean that if we continue to lose biodiversity, we will not achieve the sustainable development goals. And the case for that is made clearly in the assessment. That 30% loss of the original species abundance in the Americas by 1970 is already 40%. From 1500 to 1970, we lost 30%. From 1970 to 2010, just 40 more years, we lost another 10%. And that's projected to continue to increase. And by how much really depends on our policy choices. This figure, as you look across the bars, you can see the first one is 1970. That shows how much mean species abundance has been reduced from 1500 to 1970 and the different causes of it. And we can see that croplands and for the infrastructure, urban encroachment were the major drivers. Croplands, pasture lands, the gray, the light green, the pinks. And there's a little slice of blue. As we move forward, you can see how this is going to drop from 30% to 40% of nature lost from 2010 to 2050. Another 40 years, another 10%. And by then, the blue, which is climate change, has increased tremendously, whereas croplands, they're still important. Forestry, they're still lost there. But if we look at some of the other scenarios that we can project, the GT, that's adopting environmentally friendly technologies. That can reduce that loss by nearly half. The decentralization of governance so that people get to make more choice for themselves can reduce that loss. And changes in our choices of how and what we consume can greatly reduce, particularly the cropland and pasture land pressure on nature. All these things are available to us if we choose them. And we have to choose them, because when you look at what will happen under the scenarios of most loss, there are significant risks because the ecosystem themselves are going to be much less resilient, much more readily altered by any events we choose. The decoupling of our consumptive lifestyles from the habitats that produce what we consume and the degradation of the environment because we don't acknowledge our dependence on it are going to erode humans' sense of place, the linguistic diversity, the cultural knowledge of people in rural areas, and particularly indigenous peoples, local communities, the cultural integrity of non-urban peoples is at fundamental risk here. We have already possibly passed some environmental thresholds, some social thresholds for change. And there may be some irreversible changes that have already occurred, particularly with regard to loss of cultures and languages, loss of special habitats, and extinction of some important species. And the assessment has much more information on that. Now, I've said we have to make some different choices. How do we go about doing that? We have different classes of policy options that are available to us and the instruments to implement them. We've got area-based approaches. People know about parks, marine protected areas. There's substantial evidence in the assessment that recognizing lands of indigenous peoples and local communities where the communities manage the lands tend to have a tendency, if there's been cultural continuity in those indigenous and local communities, to manage their lands well. We have ways to limit, through regulatory action, technology, control its pollution, control its emissions, and to regulate access of tourism to sensitive areas, regulate access of fisheries, how much they can exploit. And these can and have been shown to be very effective at being able to keep tourism, fisheries, and stuff fully sustainable if they were appropriately regulated. And there are management strategies that can be implemented through regulatory measures. Strategies to restore degraded ecosystems, the ecosystem-based approaches to every resource-based industry, fishing, hunting, forestry, ecosystem-based agriculture. These are all well-developed fields of knowledge that management can implement, change the strategies to have an ecosystem base to what they do. And the benefits of those choices are already well documented. Likewise, the benefits of measures that actually try to control invasive alien species. We don't have to, the options do not include solely regulating activities. We can provide positive incentives. There are cases where payment for ecosystem services, if you're dealing with affluent cultures, is a very effective measure to allow the value of nature to be converted into a metric that these people are sensitive to. You can provide incentives through having offsets. If you have to build a piece of infrastructure that impacts nature, having incentives that you can get permission to do that if you improve at some disproportionately positive ratio degraded habitat elsewhere as an offset. We have eco-certification providing economic incentives in fisheries, in forestry, and in many other direct uses of nature. And the other pathway that is increasingly emerging as effective are rights-based approaches, delimiting the areas that indigenous peoples can manage within their own culture, giving them the right for self-governance. Decentralization and participatory governance in general, increasing the rights of local people for local decision-making, provides benefits to nature and the way nature contributes to people. Ensuring that there's benefit sharing when external interests take benefits from nature in an area. Making access to those areas for that piece of biodiversity requires sharing the benefits, isn't an option that reduces the total input. And there's even in some countries work to give rights directly to nature in legislation. So that you have to consider the right of nature to exist as part of a decision. And we're making progress on these. We've got more, bigger, and more diversified protected areas. There are positive examples of ecological restoration in every unit of analysis in the Americas. And these are summarized in the assessment. And there are strategies that have been tested for making even human-dominated landscapes, suburban landscapes, even urban ones, for managed forests, agriculture, and pasture lands, more supportive of nature biodiversity. And as we take more and more account in the future of the long-term trade-offs between our the benefits and the costs of choices where the cost is to the environment, if we take more account of the connectivity of different areas of the planet and the spillover effects of a local choice in a much larger area, we can reduce our footprint. The mainstreaming of the environmental concerns effectively into economic and social development policies is now part of dialogue in all these development agencies and needs to be given the prominence it deserves. And at all levels, from individual people to federal governments, we need to change our attitude to consumptive behaviors. And if we do those things, we will be on a better course. And that can be helped by fulfilling a few of these knowledge gaps. We haven't not come close to documenting and recording all the types of ecosystems and all their components and measuring their trends. We haven't come close to providing comprehensive assessments. Local assessments, very well done, but at larger scales, much to do in terms of the costs, benefits, and the values applied to understanding how the relationship between nature and our quality of life functions at regional, sub-regional scales. We don't have those things measured well enough yet to do the full accounting, because there's a mismatch between all the social and economic data that measures quality of life, which is always done at geopolitical scales, from a city to a province or state to a country, and the ecological data, which is most meaningfully collected biome by biome, ecosystem by ecosystem, which do not match the geographic borders. And this mismatch was a problem in many parts of the analysis and the assessment. And we can do more with better ways to tabulate the initial data. We don't have good measures of all the non-material ways that nature contributes to human well-being. And that isn't just putting a value on coastline protection from a mangrove reef. It's the psychological benefits of being able to enjoy nature, which is a non-material benefit as well. We have much still to learn about how the indirect drivers of population growth, economic development and stuff actually link to the direct drivers of habitat change, climate change, etc. And then the specific changes in biodiversity, nature's contributions to people. We have much to learn about the factors that affect our ability, once we've done a good study in a local area, how far can we extrapolate that, generalize it, scale it up from individual studies to make general statements? It's an important pattern to know, and we need to fill that knowledge gap. And then the evaluation of the short-term impacts is much simpler, of course, than the long-term impacts. But in both cases, we have not done enough to measure how effective the policies and programs we've implemented are in actually changing the trends that once we decide we need to change a trend. So that's what's in the assessment, and I'll turn it back to Håkon to tell you where to go from here.
Thank you very much for that, Jake, and for taking the time to join us here today. Before ending the webinar, I'd just like to remind all of you listening in of the resources available on the IPBES website, and to encourage you to reach out to us on tsu.capacitybuilding@ipbes.net if you have any questions. Thank you for watching. We look forward to have you join us again. Goodbye for now.